The second part of our lecture, introducing Aristotle's Politics, is going to address his taxonomy of governments or government rulers. So let's just jump right into things. Aristotle identifies four different kinds or forms of government or relations between government rulers and the citizens of the government or polis, city state. He also thinks that it's a mistake to conflate these four different forms of government. All right, so let's take a look at what these different forms of government are. On the one hand, we have what we might call political rule or rule by a politician or politicians, elected rulers. This would be like in a democracy, similar to what we have in the United States. Of course, in the United States, we have a representative republic, but that would still fall under political rule by elected leaders. Another form of government that Aristotle talks about is a monarchy. This would be a form of government that has a king or a queen at the top, at the apex of the ruling body, right? So it would be a kind of a royal family, maybe by divine right or maybe in some other form. And of course, we have monarchies in existence today and have for, since Aristotle's time. So we can use those forms of monarchies to kind of think about what Aristotle means here. Next, we have a household government. This is a little bit different from what we might normally think of as a government, but this would be the hierarchical relations that exist between, say, a father and a child, a husband and a wife, maybe the head of the household and the servants, and so forth. It would be the ruling body that is in control of or in charge of the responsibilities and the duties and so forth that exist within the household. While we don't really have this form of government per se, at least not for a large city states, nonetheless, you could still think about how this form of household government might exist in a very small political community, maybe a small tribe or a small sort of village. And then next we have what we might call master and slave political rule. This would come under the form of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, a kind of despotic rule, maybe a tyrannical rule. And again, we have these forms of government in existence today, right? So these forms of government didn't exist only in Aristotle's time or before Aristotle or in the Dark Ages or Middle Ages, if you will. We have these forms of government in existence today, right? So we can think about those sorts of governments. Maybe take, for example, a government like North Korea, or maybe a government like in Iran or in China or Russia. Even if in some sense they try to promote a kind of a democracy by name only, nonetheless, we still see sort of the basic master-slave political relations that exist amongst the rulers and the citizens. We can also see this form of government showing up in Plato's Republic when Thermachus talks about might makes right, right? So there he talked about how justice just is certain rulers creating laws and certain peasants, you might say, or citizens obeying those laws. So that would be one way that we might think about the government relations that exist between the master and the slave, the despotic ruler and the subjects that must obey the ruler. Of course, there might be other forms of government too that may or may not fit into this sort of taxonomy neatly or nicely. These would be governments like an oligarchy or a theocracy. An oligarchy is a government that's ruled by a very, very small group of individuals. So instead of having a monarchy where you have a king or a queen, rather you have a very small group of individuals. Maybe they're very wealthy individuals. Some people have made claims that the United States is an oligarchy because you might think that it's ruled by certain groups of corporations or certain people that have a lot of money and a lot of interest, and they just buy the politicians, right? They give the politicians a certain amount of money to run for elected office, but then the politicians must do whatever those corporations say. So that might be a kind of way of thinking about an oligarchy, where you have a very small group of individuals that is in complete control of the political rule in the community. A theocracy is similar, but a theocracy is based primarily on, if not entirely on, religious doctrine or religious dogma. And it's those religious authorities, those religious rulers that have the ultimate say. They are at the apex, right? They are the ones that are in control in the hierarchical structure of political rule. A great example of this would be the Roman Catholic Church, where at the top you have the Pope, who's supposed to be sitting on the seat or the throne of Peter, and speaks on behalf of God or Jesus. And basically, whenever the Pope speaks, he speaks authoritatively, and he has infallible decrees when speaking from the seat of Peter. Of course, that doesn't mean that the Pope is infallible in all regards, but nonetheless, the sort of political rule that the Pope might have over the subjects, over the people in that particular political dynamic or political structure, the Pope, being at the apex, would have complete control, the final say. And of course, the Pope might delegate certain other responsibilities and duties to other political rulers of some form, like a cardinal, a bishop, priest, and so forth. So the Roman Catholic Church, at least historically, might be another example of a theocracy. And it's not exactly clear how all that's supposed to fit into the four forms of government that Aristotle identifies. But now let's think about why Aristotle thinks that we should not make the mistake of conflating these forms of government, right? So the main point, the main issue that's at stake here is the hierarchical structure that's involved, right? So the master slave hierarchical structure is not the same as the political rulers and the governmental relations that exist amongst the politicians and the citizens. Likewise, the monarchy is not the same form of political structure that you have in the political rule, right? In the sort of ideal political rule that Aristotle is aiming at. Additionally, the household has a hierarchical structure that does not exist in the ideal political structure between politicians and the citizens. Right. So the core problem when we conflate these different forms of government is we're conflating hierarchical structures and delegating certain responsibilities and duties between the different elements or layers within that structure, where that just doesn't occur within the political rule, within the rule of a political statesmanship within the community, the political community, and amongst the citizens, right? Because for Aristotle, at least, the citizens and the political rulers are all equal. They're all human beings. They're all rational animals, and they're all aiming towards eudaimonia or human flourishing. So there is no hierarchical structure in that system of government, whereas there would be clearly within, say, a despotic or totalitarian rule, or even in the household governing rule or a monarchy and so forth. And it's for that reason, then, that Aristotle argues that the only form of political rule that's going to be adequate to promote the happiness and well-being of the citizens will involve politicians or elected rulers, rulers that are equal with the citizens, right? So we don't want a structure where you have an apex and then delegated responsibilities and duties down throughout that hierarchical structure. However, we also need to keep in mind that the version of political rule that Aristotle's going to favor, the one that he argues for, is going to require slaves. But we need to say a little bit more about what Aristotle means by slaves in order to make sure that we are interpreting him fairly. So with that in mind, then, the next thing we're going to need to do is look a little closer at Aristotle's theory of slavery as it relates to these different forms of governmental structures or different forms of governmental rule.